when a bad actor has done something and what they have done. But I think it's also important, as Admiral Ellis put it so eloquently, what we won't stand for. And the attribution has to be a critical element of that.
Thank you, Colonel. We have a number of members of the council that have questions, but I appreciate your candor and
when a bad actor has done something and what they have done.
Clear the line
but I think it's also important, as Admiral Ellis put it so eloquently, what we won't stand for. And the attribution has to be a critical element of that.
Each of your echo about thereby the importance of deterrence. Members of the council that have questions for keeping it an ocean of peace. The Director of National Intelligence, Dan Coates, recognized.
Mr. Vice President, thank you. Particularly, of course, I've paid attention to every panel, but a particularly keen attention to what was just said with this panel. The intelligence community understands that our dominance in space relative to the intelligence that we need to keep America safe and informed, on whether it's our fighters or whether it's our national assets, is of critical importance. The dominance that we've had in space has been at least on the way to being equaled, or perhaps equaled, by adversaries who wish to do us harm. And we have to recognize that, as wonderful it is to hear about the vision in the future for space and what it can provide commercially, what it can provide for human exploration. We end up here sobered up by the fact that, like other innovations that have occurred, the internet and so forth, and all the blessings that it brings and all the optimism it brings about the future, it's a double-edged sword. There's a dark side, and there's a dark side to this, and that forces us to be prepared. And so I think one of the important things this council can do is to ensure that we achieve the dominance in space necessary for us to protect our people, to keep our adversaries in a position where they can't provide the dominance that could do us wrong. So the candor and means in which this part of this panel has brought, I think, is something that we need to focus on.
Thank you, Director Coates. Any comments from the panel following the director's remarks? Before I recognize the Acting Director of Homeland Security, allow me another Indiana privilege by recognizing an astronaut who is with us today who spent 168 days in space, 4 missions, 41 hours of spacewalks, and he is the pride of his home state of Indiana. Astronaut David Wolf is with us today. Thank you, David. May not forgive me for that, but had to do it. Secretary Duke.
Thank you for allowing the time to get my microphone on before you called on me. I appreciate it. I definitely agree that we need a space strategy, a space security strategy. And I've heard 2 different things among the 3 panels. One is critical infrastructure in space. So we have commercial, we have a national defense, and it would almost argue for addressing some of the threats as critical infrastructure align with that. So in the commercial sector, we'd have to make sure we have cybersecurity and national defense, the resilience you talked about. But then someone, and I believe it was you, Admiral Ellis, mentioned space as critical infrastructure. If we take your recommendation for this strategy, should we be looking at space as a critical infrastructure and all the security needs we'd have it across the national defense, homeland security, and commercial? Do you have any recommendations?
Well, I think you're exactly right, Madam Secretary. The reality is that in space, as in so many other domains, as Director Coates knows well, the line between what is a national security asset and what is a commercial asset has long been blurred. We rely very, very heavily in the military, in today's military, on commercial entities, and so that's the reason that the definition critical infrastructure writ large, it's inappropriate anymore to parse it out very narrowly on military only or national security only or intelligence community only capabilities, because we are reliant on that full range of capabilities as resident space, including commercial, in order to accomplish that mission. It's a complete system now and needs to be addressed as such, and that's why I use the critical infrastructure term and think that a strategy needs to be focused on how we can effectively secure that in its entirety, not just protect one element of it that may have a DoD or an intelligence community label.
I'd like to echo that, and there's a piece of this that it's a systems engineering problem. So you've heard from 3 panels today. Each civil, commercial, and national security space are all inextricably linked together, particularly by this infrastructure, but also by other technologies. And when you stop and think about the number of ATM transactions that go through commercial geosatellites today, and ask yourself about critical infrastructure, you begin to see that it's not just a launch pad or other types of capabilities that are in that critical path. So from my perspective, it's very, very important that the strategy looks across all the domains and is an integrated systems engineering approach to what is the architecture of that infrastructure that we need, how will we support it, and if we make changes to what we're doing today in one area, how it affects all the other areas.
I'd like to add a quick comment to put some numbers on what Admiral Ellis was talking about. 80% of our national security communications go via commercial satellite routes. If we were to lose that infrastructure, our national security communications would be greatly reduced in capability. When we talk about economic infrastructure, I don't think the general public realizes the extent to which the global positioning system's timing signal is critical for these ATM transactions and every other point of sale transaction conducted in the United States and throughout most of the world. I have to ask the question, to what extent do we believe that we have defended ourselves if an adversary can bring our economic system near collapse? We may not lose a single piece of hardware, but we're not functioning as a nation.
Thank the panel. Thank you, Madam Secretary. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson.
You've touched on a couple of areas that I think are really important, and I want to go a little deeper on them. We know that our adversaries are developing anti-satellite weapons, other capabilities to degrade our capabilities, both our military and our security capabilities, and impacts on commercial capabilities as well. And as you've pointed out, deterrence, having a strong posture has always been what has been reliable in the past. And much of that is built with allies and partners in the past. We have existing structures of alliances today. To what extent are they the proper platforms to build out these capabilities through allies and partners, whom also are developing certain capabilities in space themselves? Or is the nature of this threat, does it require a different platform or structure for building and strengthening these approaches through allies and partners? And the second question I have gets to the conflict, the likelihood of conflict, and I think this was touched on earlier as well. We've practiced a lot to deconflict maritime operations with our adversaries, to deconflict air operations. We have not practiced, and we do not have the standards and norms to practice deconfliction in space. And do you have ideas about the ways to address that, and what are the norms that would be the basis for beginning to engage in deconfliction capabilities as well? So 2 separate but not unrelated questions.
Well, I'll be glad to take the first shot at it. First, in interest of brevity, allies are absolutely essential in this effort going forward. If anything, even more so than the atmospheric and the maritime domain, space is a true global commons. And the number of participants that are involved actively in space with satellites and space programs of their own is well over 100 now. And so if we're talking about coming together and collective security, it makes great deal of sense to integrate those efforts and to have commonality when appropriate. We understand the challenges of technology transfer that was talked about in another panel, but I do think the mutual security elements of this are going to be essential because just as Dr. Griffin indicated, a lot of our communications go through commercial satellites. Not all of those commercial satellites we use are U.S. satellites, and so I think there's a logical extension there. With regard to conflict and deconflict, I think, if I might default back to the maritime domain again, over many centuries we had an ability to rub the rough edges off these relationships and create rules of the road in the maritime domain and ultimately acceptable behaviors. Even supranational organizations such as the International Maritime Organization and the International Civil Aviation Organization were constructed and ultimately follow on treaties and relationships. Which of these are applicable to space is something we need to explore. Not all of them, as I said earlier, may work, but I think that's the direction we need to go so that we can help people understand and avoid accidents and avoid miscalculation on the part of allies. It's not that we have to tell people exactly what we will do in every situation, but it's absolutely essential that they understand and we communicate through whatever means, not necessarily publicly, where our major concerns are, so that we don't stumble into confrontation, much less conflict, on a random basis.
I think that from an international perspective, we have a strong partnership in the Five Eyes, and we really should be building on that. When you think about resilience and persistence and reconstitution, the geographical diversity that comes with having partners around the world, both in space surveillance, but potentially in launch, in command and control nodes, ground tracking stations, and so forth, absolutely essential as a part of that architecture. I thought Admiral Ellis's comments about norms were very good. I will make one additional comment to that, which is that norms and standards need to be things that we are also willing to do. It will not work if we say, oh, we don't want people to do certain things. Well, if we need to do it, we're just going to go ahead and do it anyway. And that's why those norms and standards need to be based on safety and clarity. In other words, not confusing people about intentions and so forth. And a wonderful example of norms and standards that have been adopted internationally that have a strong technical basis are the orbital debris mitigation standards developed by NASA and proliferated throughout the world that most countries have agreed to do from a safety standpoint, right? The sustainability of space. And so those norms and standards need to be based on practical safety and clarity as opposed to preferences and wishes.
Thank you. The panel, Dr. Griffin, another thought on this.
Just a quick comment. You asked about, Mr. Secretary, you asked about alliances. The United States is a great nation. We all hope always will be. Great nations, of course, must be prepared sometimes to lead alone if necessary, but great nations also understand the value of alliances and partnerships, and nowhere is this more true or has proven more true than in space. Going forward, if we want to know what a conflict of the future looks like without our space assets, we need to look to the past and look at World War II. I don't think we want to repeat that experience. Our allies don't want to repeat it. The value of the Western alliance that we have, the value of our alliances with Japan, South Korea, other nations, Pam mentioned the Five Eyes, these are critical to carry forward with us in space. Absolutely critical.
Well, I want to thank the panel. And a few more comments. Let me recognize the President's Homeland Security Advisor, Tom Bossert, for a comment or question.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President, and I am thrilled to be part of this long overdue council. I think the National Space Council has a lot of challenges ahead of it and a lot of opportunities. So maybe a quick question, and Dr. Griffin, you've already perhaps addressed it. So I'll ask if I can get you to expand upon your thoughts from a security perspective, both physical and cyber. I'm really interested in your views and the panel's views on the vulnerabilities and challenges to a reliable, sustained space-based positioning, navigation, and timing infrastructure, and in particular, the relationships or the actions that we need to take to maintain American preeminence. I understand there's competitors to the GPS system that we've relied upon so heavily, but I also understand there are vulnerabilities that are being exploited on a regular basis, and that timing function is not only critical physically, but to our cyber operations. And so if I could ask that question, and then before I finish, add to Mick Mulvaney's comments. This isn't a question, but perhaps off the stage, I'd like to understand your considerations and your views on the considerations involved in delineating outer space in our declarative policy as that affects our commercial partners.
Well, I'll go first. To the second question, to answer your second question, whether on or off stage, I'm always available for those sorts of discussions. You have only to ask. Obviously, I'm a person who leans forward in saying that we need to be very clear, as Admiral Ellis has so succinctly said, about what we will do and what we will accept and what we won't accept. And I do think that needs to be part of our declarative policy. With regard to GPS and frankly other elements of our critical infrastructure, we need to be extremely clear that an attack on these assets is an attack on the United States because it influences critically our way of dealing with conflict, and that we will not tolerate it. GPS is vulnerable in a number of ways. I'm not going to go into those ways in this environment. We need to do everything we can to proliferate GPS-derived but GPS-independent methods of capturing and preserving our timing signals and our navigational information. We need to make it clear that we will protect our space assets, that we do not allow our adversaries an unfettered field of force application in space, that we choose not to be the first, but that we will assuredly be the last. I'm sorry.
Well, thank you for the question. I echo Mike's comments on PNT and your understanding, certainly, Dr. Bossert. It's also worth noting that, you know, we've made great strides since GPS was first invented. It began as a transit system for the Navy years ago, and we worked through GPS 1, 2, and 3. And while we could all agree that we need to have that capability to move much more rapidly through that, there are opportunities to incrementally evolve our capabilities in space to ensure that continued access and security that we need to fully capitalize on. And as Mike has indicated, a lot of those elements are classified, but they're certainly doable. Secondly, with regard to the declaratory policy, you know, you can look back in history, and we've had declaratory policies, and declaratory doesn't mean necessarily in a public press release. We've let adversaries know, particularly in relation to elements of the nuclear command and control network, how we would view anything that disrupted or disturbed, much less destroyed those capabilities. And so there's a precedent for this kind of a communication once we decide exactly what that policy and strategy needs to be going forward.
Colonel?
Yes, I'd just like to add that this is not something that's caught us all by surprise. When I was at DARPA, we were working closely with the service labs and the services to ensure that we had GPS-independent methods of navigation, and that technology development is absolutely essential. Interestingly, you know, long-term, it can have a different technology benefit as we reach out into the solar system, where we will not have the benefit of GPS position information. So that's a very important technology development effort. But I'd like to reiterate exactly what Dr. Griffin said, because although we may have those capabilities for national security to be GPS independent, that is not the case for our economic environment here in the U.S. And of course, the economic health of the U.S. is a national security matter, and it will be years before any changes occur in that environment. They will change very slowly. There's tremendous commercial dependence on it. And so I agree with Dr. Griffin that an attack on GPS is an attack on the U.S.
Thank you, panel, and thank you, Tom. We're going to recognize the Vice Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Paul Selva, and then the Deputy Secretary of Defense for some closing remarks before we hear from the National Security Advisor. General, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Thank you to all of our panel members for taking your personal time to be here today to represent all three segments of our space architecture and infrastructure. And it occurs to me as I listen to all three panels, particularly this one, that command and control is inexorably linked to very elegant and timely, as you said, Pamela, space situational awareness. And I would like to ask the panel, can you give us a couple of concrete near-term things you think we can do, not only to facilitate the command and control of commercial and civil space, but also to provide for the kind of space situational awareness that's necessary to enforce those norms and standards of safe behavior, as well as to attribute the kinds of attacks or interference with our systems that we might observe through that structure?
I think this is a case where safety lies in numbers. I believe that the concept of a centralized command and control node, centralized observation points, is frankly as dead as the battleship after Pearl Harbor. Every node in our networks with today's information technology, every node can be a command and control node. We need to work out a strategy and a hierarchy for how such devolution would take place in the event of conflict, but the enemy should know that there is no central point of attack which could render us incapacitated. I'll stop there.
Thank you, General. I echo Mike's comments, and I hope you didn't interpret my comments on the neighborhood watch and my opening statement as trivializing it. I believe that along the lines of Mike's conversation, in addition to command and control, each of these resources up there can be outfitted with a rudimentary sensor suite of some stripe that could then collectively feed this network and this awareness. We're belatedly, arguably, moving on a much more capable space fence. That ought to be just the first step in ensuring situational awareness. As you are fully aware, there are now commercial enterprises out there that can network ground-based systems of sensors to not with the same fidelity and accuracy of our national security resources, but certainly contribute information and insight to this. This is a collective effort. This is a team sport going forward, and by team I don't just mean U.S. civilian, I mean allies and partners as well around the globe, and I think this is absolutely essential.
Admiral Ellis is right. There have been tremendous advances in distributed sensor networks, where you have distributed sensors that all coordinate together, where the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, and that technology is widely available. As I talked about, there's some commercial sensors now for space surveillance, essentially academic telescopes, commercial telescopes, and radars. And this information is available today. It's being purchased by commercial entities, by the SDA. I think that's an immediate step that could be taken, would be to bring this data in. One of the biggest concerns about it is how can you trust this data? Even today, there are analysts who look at all the data that comes in, even from our certified sensors, and analyze it to evaluate whether there's biases that are developing, whether weather is having a negative effect on the information that we're gathering. But that's pretty much a hand-done process that takes about 4 or 5 days to really be sure how confident you are in the quality of what you're looking at. All of that can be automated relatively easily, and that's a very, very important aspect of it. When you get a new piece of information, you need to be able to tell immediately whether something actually just happened on orbit, or if one of your distributed sensors has been spoofed and is giving you incorrect information. And that is incredibly important. And it is possible to automate that. We've seen the technologies be developed for it. So I think that, General, in the near term, that's something that should be looked at.
That's great. For the last comment or question, the Deputy Secretary of Defense, Pat Shanahan.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. Maybe to bring us home and where we started, space is the opportunity. And I think the previous comments kind of steered us towards some of the challenges, but and this question I think goes to Admiral Ellis. Now, you've had an extraordinary career and some very remarkable experiences, maybe in the context of looking forward, when you think about how, and this pertains to your experience in the Navy as a pilot, as Strategic Command Commander, as maritime law evolved, does that serve as a basis for us to think about international convention or regulation? And how should we use that to shape this opportunity?
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I certainly do think it does apply. It's a template against which we can compare the space environment and our challenges there, and quite frankly, cyberspace as well. As I mentioned earlier, some things will translate, some things may not, and that's part of our judgment and our evaluation process, but it's certainly a starting point. And as you know, and as we discussed, over time, we've come to establish and agree to and actively participate in and support a global understanding of what the rules of behavior are and what they are not. We can call out people very clearly and very candidly when they violate those rules. It's taken a long time to do that. Unfortunately, in space, things have evolved at a pace where those kinds of policies and those opportunities haven't been presented. Things happen too fast. I mean, the technology we are talking about today, began, essentially about 60 years ago. And so it's time to play catch up. And I think the maritime can begin a discussion. It can talk about the treaties, as I mentioned, and the supranational organizations. But at the end of the day, we also need to get it down to the tactical. We created, even during the dark days of the Cold War, the so-called incident at sea agreements with the Russians, where we agreed what we would and would not do under certain circumstances to avoid miscalculation and accidents and collisions and potentially misunderstandings and misinterpretation of hostile intent. And those kinds of dialogues, that full spectrum of engagement based on those applicable elements of the maritime experience, I think are a great starting point for that policy and strategy discussion. And as the preeminent spacefaring leader, we need to lead that effort and not just accept what gets handed to us or what evolves or what someone else who might risk us ill, as was mentioned earlier, might choose to advance as an alternative solution.
That's great. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Pat. Very, very thoughtful. And would you all join me in thanking this extraordinary group of Americans for their presentation today. Thank you all. This has obviously been an enormously important discussion for our country, and one that we will continue on the National Space Council in appropriate settings. I'm grateful for the panelists for their time, and I want to commend members of the Council for your thoughtful participation in this panel and in the previous panels. General McMaster, President's National Security Advisor, you and your team have been working on guiding interagency development of the space strategic framework. I wondered if you would offer a few thoughts, perhaps an unclassified overview on the status of those efforts.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President, and thanks to everyone who came today, and especially those around the table who we've been working with over the past several months to develop the space strategic framework, a framework that I think will be valuable as we continue this discussion, as we learn from the expertise that's here today and even beyond this room. So as Marilyn Houston mentioned on the first panel, Mr. Vice President, the pace of technology is increasing. And what we see is a combination of greater counter space threats and a greater demand for space services, rapidly expanding commercial industry, and untapped potential of space exploration. All of this is calling for an integrated strategy to ensure that the United States' vital interests are advanced. And so much of the strategic framework is classified, Mr. Vice President, but what I'll do today is highlight some of the key elements very quickly that are unclassified. And what I'd like to do is really discuss four key elements of the strategy. First, our strategic framework seeks to ensure U.S. leadership, preeminence, and freedom of action in space, and I think based on the discussion today, we'll actually emphasize across all domains more in the document as well, but to ensure that preeminence for decades to come. Second, while the strategic framework promotes an America First approach, it is consistent with what the panelists have said and what you have said many times, Mr. Vice President, that America First doesn't mean America alone. To the contrary, we will secure the benefits of space, not only for ourselves, but for and with our friends and allies as an essential part of this framework. Third, the framework defines our vital interests in space, and again, we may modify this about how space relates to vital interests in other domains as well, based on Dr. Griffin's and others' emphasis on the cross-domain aspects. But we want to ensure unfettered access to and freedom to operate in the space domain to advance the security, economic prosperity, and scientific knowledge of the nation. And I think that parallels really the composition of the three panels today. And then fourth, as Dennis Muhlenberg mentioned, the framework also outlines four primary objectives in pursuit of our vital interests. And this is the beginning of an integrated strategy to guard against what Admiral Ellis said is, we don't want this strategic vacuum. And these are the four objectives. First, to strengthen the safety, stability, and sustainability of space activities. I think based on Dr. Griffin's comments, we might add resilience there as well. Second, to deter and, when necessary, defeat adversary space and counter-space threats that are hostile to the national interests of the United States and our allies. We may not start it again, but we'll finish it. We'll be the last. Consistent with what we've heard from the great panelists today, we will, as a third objective, partner with the U.S. commercial sector to ensure that American companies remain the leading providers of traditional and innovative space technologies, goods, and services on the international space market. And then fourth, the fourth objective, to maintain and extend U.S. human presence and robotic beyond Earth to transform knowledge of ourselves, our planet, our solar system, and the universe. And so, with your concurrence, Mr. Vice President, once you're able to review this, what we will do with your approval is we will now begin to flesh out this strategic framework. We'll identify, and we'll do this collaboratively with those who are here today and beyond, we'll identify the specific tasks, the resources, and the authorities required. We'll identify measures of effectiveness, and we'll do a periodic assessment of what we're doing. We're going to move out, Mr. Vice President, and as Admiral Ellis has said, as Colonel McElroy said, we have to emphasize speed and move out quickly. Thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Well, thank you, General. And if there is no further comment from members of the Council regarding the strategy that General McMaster outlined, and hearing none, I would simply direct you to continue to work with other members of the Council and to develop an implementation plan for that framework over the next 45 days for presentation to President Trump for his approval. So we'll proceed on that basis, General. Thank you very much. We are at the end of this first meeting of the National Space Council. I want to thank each of the members of the Council and your staffs for what has been an enlightening and engaging dialogue. And from where I'm sitting, and I trust where the President is sitting, a very good start on a new beginning for the National Space Council and for the development of renewed American energy in space exploration, both in the area of civil space exploration, commercial space exploration, and of course, our presence in space that contributes to our national security. Also, I want to thank our staff in particular, and you could stand while I say your name, Darius Meeks, who's our policy director, Scott Pace, who's leading the National Space Council, Jared Stout, and the team. Thank you for pulling together a very successful day. I'm very pleased. Good job, guys. Lastly, to be brief to my fellow council members, you have your marching orders. Let's work on a 45-day time frame for turning around recommendations and proposals to the President based upon this first meeting of the National Space Council. I think today we proved that that many of the best ideas that will shape American space policy will come from outside the halls of government. And I can assure all of those present that we're going to continue to avail ourselves of the very best and brightest American minds as we develop policies for presentation to President Trump. I'm pleased to report in that vein that very soon the President has directed us to relaunch the National Space Council's advisory group to foster close coordination, cooperation, technology, information. This group will bring together a broad range of truly exceptional Americans, men and women who are committed to advancing and renewing American leadership in space. In the days ahead, NASA will enter a notice into the Federal Register to kick off the process of recruiting candidates for the group, and the President will make a selection based on the recommendations of the National Space Council for who is appointed to that. And we encourage any citizens who have an interest to avail yourself of the opportunity to express that interest going forward. The members will all be private citizens, but their work for this council will be of the highest public service. So I think we heard many themes today. I won't take any more of people's times other than to say thank you. Thank you to all of our. Could we give another round of applause to the distinguished panels that presented today? We're grateful for your time. I'm grateful for and inspired by your words and your leadership. I'm grateful for members of the National Space Council, cabinet members who are here. Thank you for making this a priority. We got a lot of work to do, but as the President said in his inaugural address, in America we understand that a nation is only living as long as it is striving. And with the President's strong leadership, with the participation of this Council, with the support of many distinguished Americans, I'm confident America will lead in space again. Thank you very much, and God bless you.